Welcome back to Imperfect, the Heart-Centered Leadership Podcast. And Mark and I spoke back in 2024. It just seems so funny to say that. And today's the day, Mark. I want to welcome you to the show. And I think the interview was meant to be today.
Well, I so enjoyed meeting you in our first conversation. It felt like we would just fall into conversation whenever we might be together and it would be good and meaningful. And I'm looking forward to this.
Well, that conversation really helped me dig into my questions. And we've got all of your great info below, your bio, your social media links for our listeners. So I'm going to jump into my leadership questions because I had a little bit of a deeper dive because of our first conversation. So the first question that I want to ask you is about leading with heart and strategy. And here's the question I've put together for you. In today's business world, leaders often face the challenge of balancing the wonderful element of strategic decision making with empathy and emotional intelligence, a little bit of a trifecta. Mark, how do you integrate both to lead effectively while maintaining a heart-centered approach?
Wow. That's a way to start out with a real softball, quick.
I know. I'm coming right out of the gate.
Yeah. Well, I actually feel like I've got a ready answer for that comes from a lot of hard work across the years and self-reflection, listening to what people are telling me and how they're experiencing me and all of that. And I have found a little exercise that helps me shortcut to this and be able to answer that kind of a question in the moment where there's a lot at stake. So as a human being, I have an intellect and I have emotions, and emotions precede intellect, even if I feel like I'm not an emotional person. And I also have a body where I experience desire or want. And it is really helpful, and I am a better leader if those three areas are integrated and working together rather than one being shoved into a closet and the door's locked. So when the pressure is on in particular, I find that if I ask myself, what do I want? And what do I feel? And what do I think about this, whatever's going on? And are those answers in agreement or not?
Yeah.
And if they're not, what do I need in order to face this as a whole person, not fractured, not reactive, forward thinking, where my best self is present? And I am getting better at that, far from perfect, but getting better at stopping, breathing, taking a drink of water and saying, give me just a second, and responding with something would say, well, I want this and I feel this and I think that. So then, and then I've got more of an answer. One more quick thing about this, Deb, that I have experienced is that for me, Mark, I need to start with a what do I want and what do I feel, or I won't get there. I'll only be stuck in my head. And I'll be thinking, but I'll be thinking without the data of what my desire is and what my emotions are, which can be early warning signs that something is really good or something might not be so good. And so by being whole there, I've got all of the data points and I'm not shoving those aside because they'll come back up later. Like I'll be walking out to the parking lot or whatever and doggone it, this is what I really wanted. Now I'm angry, or nobody listened to me, or I never got a chance, that kind of thing. And it just shuts a lot of that down.
Yeah.
All that being said, heart is present then and empathy is present then because I took the moment to check on myself. Others might need to start with what they think, or they'll be so nervous that their brain shuts off. Others might need to start with their emotions. Otherwise, the denial muscle that they have is so strong, they'll get stalled and they'll have to play cleanup later. So that's how I'm currently working at it.
And I know you can handle these questions because they're heavy, but I don't even know what to add to that other than people do fight with the IQ, EQ. It's the teeter totter. And I loved how you framed that. Love that, Mark. I'm going to use that. See,
Something I could remember.
You're talking, and I'm thinking in my mind, going, he's going to come back with, I can't get to what I need until I do. So we're so aligned. Okay, let's talk in my next question about navigating difficult conversations with emotional intelligence. It's a nice segue from what we were just chatting about. So, as leaders, it's inevitable we face tough conversations, whether it's delivering feedback, addressing conflict, or even making hard decisions. Name a strategy that would ensure that these conversations could be handled with both emotional intelligence and, of course, my favorite, heart-centered leadership.
I want to be direct and to hold a loving space.
Yeah.
That's the formula that I want to operate by. And I have finally reached, I think, a point of wisdom where I know that no matter how I do it, if I'm responsible for that conversation, there's going to be criticism. People aren't going to kiss my hands and embrace me necessarily afterwards and say, you're just so good at this. And I agree with everything you said. Sometimes that will happen. More often than not, it doesn't. Every now and then someone comes to you a few years later and says, best thing that ever happened to me is when you gave me that feedback. I hated you in that moment, but now I so respect what you did. If I may do a quick aside, I was just talking with someone last week who operates in this way, very direct person, very loving person. They lost a child not too long ago and had a funeral. And one of the persons who has reached out to him since then was a person that he let go from work several years before, and it did it in a way that mutual respect was maintained. Well, to maintain mutual respect means that when you deliver hard information, you also grant dignity and hold space. And I have benefited from starting to use the words, I'm going to describe something. Might be hard to hear, but I want you to know I've done my work to try to pull any energy I might have out of this so that we can just look at this thing as an issue and what's coming, because maybe we've had to make a decision about this already. But here it is. I'm going to describe this. Now, do you see this differently or not? And that invites me as well to be able to say, yes, I understand how you feel and all that, but I'm really trying to look at this issue or this piece of feedback. Can you see it, or what am I not seeing? Now, then we can talk about repercussions and ramifications. So if I can hold the space while delivering hard information, keep it as descriptive as I can, grant dignity to that person, I think I'm getting more effective. And I'm watching others who do this really well, who seem to just have a knack for it. And this is the sort of thing that they do. And so I'm trying to model myself after where I'm seeing it being done well.
That's such a good point. And I think it's something we all have to work on, because it's not a skill you hone and keep using to allow any semblance of complacency to show up. And one of the things that I was taught at hospice when I did my grief and bereavement training is sometimes when you don't know what to say, you can pause and just gently lean in with your upper body. And it's just that nonverbal cue to say, I'm here, we're sharing space, I need a minute. And I find the way that you described how you navigate it, I think it allows two things. I think it allows a meaningful alignment in the moment.
Yes.
And I also think it allows the beauty of an organic conversation.
Yeah.
It is a skill. And I've seen people do this really, really well. And it's assertive leadership at its best. It really is.
Right. And if you remove the obstacles or barriers, things that you might do to protect yourself and put a border, and you occupy a vulnerable space, but with your own sense of security, you are actually granting some of that dignity to the person.
Absolutely.
You're making yourself human to be with them. And I love what you just said, to lean in, especially as you're listening.
Yeah. It can be
And
physical, intellectual, however you want to lean in. It's all the feels, right?
right.
And I watched an oncologist teach me this. And he said, just gently lean in.
Gently.
And he said, watch your face, watch your body, don't be tense. And he just kept modeling it. And now I find I do it almost instinctively, intuitively. It's just a learned,
Yeah.
and we don't always have to have an answer. We can pause and just bask and reflect in where we're at in that crucial conversation. It doesn't have to be fluent and seamless. It can be bumpy and pause. And I think it's a social norm that we've learned as people. And I think good leaders are slowly kind of changing the narrative of that.
I agree with you. I wish this was as intuitive for me as you've described it for you, even though you've learned and practiced. Intuitive to me, the natural thing for me is if I have something to say, is to lean in. And if I'm listening, to kind of rest back,
Mm-hmm.
to be more relaxed. But if you're on the other side of my face when that happens, if I'm leaning in to say something, that's more intense. And
Yeah.
if I'm leaning back, it's like I'm creating distance to the speaker. I
Yeah.
have the fight
Yeah.
of the time, my natural bent
Yeah.
in that way.
That space is very delicate. Yeah. It's a great point.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about sustaining what I want to call a people first culture in business. And here's the question I kind of framed for you. Imagine a high pressure environment where it's easy for leaders to become task focused and lose sight of the human element. How do you ensure that heart centered leadership can remain a priority in your organization and still drive performance and results?
One of the good things among many that EOS has brought to organizations. So the entrepreneurial operating system.
Yeah.
People maybe have read Traction or Scaling Up and have got some familiarity with it. And I would imagine you've got some listeners that they've got EOS coming out their ears and out their nose and they love it or they don't love it or whatever. But one of its great gifts is the check-in kind of question
Yeah.
that is codified right into every meeting. Now, the danger is that if you're talking about, well, here's my up and my down, my professional one, my business one, my personal one, is that you just treat that as a checklist. Like I've got one, okay, check, now we're moving on. But that provides opportunity for an emotionally intelligent leader to be culturally aware and personally aware of their people. That agenda item doesn't make it happen. It just makes it possible. What makes it happen is we have built in these moments to be human together as we start, to remind each other of our values, to all get into the same room at the same time, to do the same thing. And then we're together and we're a community doing this work rather than rushing in, rushing out, and we're rushing in with all of our invisible suitcases, all the emotional baggage from the previous meeting. We're still writing an email in our mind while other people are talking, even though we're saying what our ups and our downs are. So when we take that moment, the very aware leader is able to engage in some back and forth, maybe adjust the questions slightly so somebody has to stop and think so that their response isn't automatic, to bring winsomeness into those moments, to acknowledge how important this is, to cheer for people. One quick tool I really love to do and found so helpful is, let's say somebody announces something really good, to be able to stop and say, let's just acknowledge how great that is.
Yeah. The
It
little
doesn't-
micro wins.
Little micro wins and one breath, to be able to relish it as opposed to, oh, that's nice. Great to hear. Thank you. Oh, that's wonderful. Moving on. Right.
Yeah.
So we we put a little bit of margin in our
Yes.
conversations
Yes.
so that we can acknowledge each other instead of using each other as tools.
I got to add to that because I love it. I also have clients have that pause, not just for the micro wins, but for all the imperfections.
Oh, good.
And we stop, and it's a micro win because we convert it to a lesson.
Wonderful.
And I always love using the story of post-it notes. There was a problem on the line with the glue when Art Fry was running the show that day at 3M, and I think that turned out okay.
It did. And there's this great question in the middle of those micro lessons to be able to say something. What do we have here? Something like,
Yes.
what do we have here? Is there any use for this? And so often the innovative breakthroughs come from those questions, that conversation, because if we already knew the solution we were looking for, we wouldn't have to invent it. We'd have it.
And when you share the imperfection for the greater good of the team, the division, the department, the culture at large,
Wonderful.
other divisions and departments, they love it because they're like, oh, we can see how that can transition into our department. And it lands up being this automated game of telephone, if you will, because that's what it turns out to be. And it's something negative that happened, but it got converted to a lesson, which turned into an amended process or a new process or better communication. And I always smile when we get to the other side. And when I first suggested this years ago to one of my COOs, like he looked at me like I was crazy. And he's like, where are you going with this? And I gave a good example. And they actually have an imperfection jar now full of candy.
Oh, cool.
And so when someone has an imperfection, they celebrate it, they learn from it, they convert it, but it's a micro win too. And why not? Let's take a negative connotation from language and it can be a micro win. So I love that. Okay, let's.
You added to it. That's great.
What's that?
I'm really glad that you added to that.
Yeah, you made me think of it. So this is what happens on the show. We banter, right? Okay, the last question I want to talk about, and you've talked a little bit about it in question 1, the inner work of being a leader within your leadership. So heart-centered leadership comes from within. It's that long distance that really isn't that long, but it is for some between their brain and their heart. What personal practice or habit, Mark, have you utilized to strengthen your own emotional intelligence so that you're leading with authenticity? Especially now, I'm still feeling we're navigating uncertainty and challenging times globally as global citizens.
Yeah.
What kind of keeps you grounded in that space?
Well, I will offer a habit and a framework. I have a habit taught to me by a 12-year-old when I was 13, which was to write the equivalent of about a page a day of my thoughts. And I was thinking, well, this younger guy who I already really liked as a friend and things is doing this thing. I want to be like that. And it just became a lifelong habit. So the stuff that's going on to be able in a written form to give some expression is so helpful. It empties out and fills up at the same time. For others, it's a quiet conversation in a coffee nook, or it is that run in the morning, or it is drawing a picture, or any number of things that we can do. But it sets you, it orients you to what you care about most. And I have this wonderful library shelf full of journals since I was 13 years old that is there that I can keep drawing on. And it might not ever be useful for anybody else, but it sure serves me well.
I love that. Do you know when I wrote the Heart-Centered Leadership Playbook, I ripped apart journals.
I bet you did.
From many decades. And then DOS, remember DOS?
Right.
DOS documents and then Word. And when I dumped them all into a central repository, a file on Google Drive, I had 49,000 words.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, okay,
Yeah.
we just got to get organized now. But
There. Yeah.
I didn't want to rip the journals, but I had no way of scanning. And this was the quickest, easiest. But I thought, what a work in the making of thinking for decades. And I still don't do it every day, but are you still friends with that guy?
We have not been in touch for some years, but we would catch up and be able to go right from.
That's so awesome. There's your sign. You have to call him now and tell him that you're still doing that.
I will take that as an assignment.
There's your
Not
call
using
to
that.
action.
I will do that. The framework that I use all of the time, and I think in this conversation I'm betraying the fact that I am kind of a systems and framework person. But I go back to E.F. Schumacher's work on the four frames of reference or four fields of knowledge, as he would talk about it. And it's just a Johari window exercise.
Yeah.
Here I am as a person. I have an internal field. Many people are not in touch with their internal. They're such empiricists. They only trust what their senses tell them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not what's going on internally. But there are others. They're so intuitive. They're so emotion forward that they don't trust what they're sensing. In fact, they're driving the world to experience them because of what's in them spills out so readily. But I've only described two fields. The other two fields are present in a conversation like this. So I have an internal field and an external field by which I'm observing the world. At this moment, Deb, you're on the other side of my face virtually. So you're experiencing the world, including how you see and perceive me. And you have an internal field of your own. I can't know those other two fields at all unless you trust me enough to tell me.
Yeah.
And it is in that exchange that I get a much more robust picture with which to reflect. So we've got two problems here. One is if I am not trusting my inner field.
Yeah.
And the other is if I am only trusting my inner field. So with the heart-centered leadership, it's to give it its place as a very important component of data and how I can perceive. But I must also have relationships with the outer world and people that are trusting enough that I can get the feedback that I really need as I reflect and use my heart in a much more appropriate way.
Yeah.
And it just being all stirring around inside of me. It's in an interfacing way. I have found that to be so helpful in putting together perspective.
I think I want to close this part off by saying so many leaders have an intention to speak well, and they eloquently speak their thoughts, and they're not able to articulate how they're feeling within those thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Could you imagine if we were all regulated? Mark, you and I wouldn't have any work to do.
Well, I agree with you. Even a person who is heart-centered naturally, in so many cases, has been driven by family and cultural forces to set that aside very quickly and move to headspace.
Yeah.
And because of that, they're very skilled at doing so, can do it almost as fast as a person who starts in their head.
Yeah.
And may have an extra step to get back in touch with themselves because they've discarded the most available thing for them when they have a first impulse. They're not examining it and then setting it aside. They're just setting it aside because it's not welcome and then going to heads.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move into my Fab Four.
All right.
We're going to go down the vulnerable valley here.
Okay.
So I want you to finish this sentence and get as vulnerable as you want to get with our listeners. If people really knew me, they would know. Finish that sentence for us.
If people really knew me, they would know that I carry a lot of sorrow. So that would, they would know that I am working through that all of the time in order to be able to engage in life and experience real happiness, which I do, and joy, which I do. Sorrow is never far away. I walked with my first wife for a very long time in a very brutal form of cancer that took 16 years to take her, and 19 occurrences along the way, and no remission. And we raised our family during that time. That has a way of shaping you, forming you, making you what you are, adding, a patina to your life, bringing many, many good things and very hard won things. And but you accumulate stories that are beautiful to tell, and stories where you wish it could have been different. And so I am able to tap into those rapidly, and sometimes when I'm not wanting to, because they're there. They are a gift to me, and it is just also something that I bear. And this would be one of the biggest reasons why I don't want to waste time in meetings. I want to get after what we're after. I want to do it from the heart centered place. I want to do it with real people. But I don't want to have the meeting twice. Why? Because life is too short.
Yeah, that's impactful. And I join you on that grief journey, and it's not linear and it's not messy, but
Okay.
boy, does it make us good heart-centered leaders. Yeah,
It adds. It doesn't just take away, it also adds.
it really does. Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, if your leadership style had a song, what would it be? This is where I'm really going to get to know you now, Mark.
My leadership style had a song. What would it be? Wow. What I find my mind doing is going to song titles that I know and wondering, does that speak about it, as opposed to saying, what's my song? So I'll tell you about.
My Irish dad would say, what's on the top of your mind?
Yeah, well, I am not a big classical music buff. I enjoy classical music, but it's not the genre I would turn to. But if my leadership style had a song, I know what I would want it to be. I would want it to be Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, particularly the Ode to Joy. Partly because that whole thing is rooted in the philosophy of human development, achieving its highest aspirations, also how it is carried forward in timelessness. But behind it all, and I've been writing about this of late, is the fact that, and in its final composition and its first performance, Beethoven is deaf. So he has used his gifts as they're declining in the purest form possible to compose something that we sing at or play at the moments of our highest triumph, like the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
Hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
Who knows, about any of our lives, but that would hold my own personal aspirations.
Beautiful. Okay, summarize one key takeaway. What's your leadership doggy bag for our listeners? What do you want them to take away? What's the nugget from the conversation?
I believe it would be that it is okay to stop, breathe, and gather yourself before plunging in. So steady will trump speed in those moments.
Yeah. It makes me think I'm a yoga teacher. And I always love ending my classes having all the yogis sit up on their mat, and we cross our legs and we fall into heart pose, and we're just coming back. We're coming back from this beautiful journey. And I always use the mantra, and I point to every single person. I just keep moving my hands so I get that connection. And I always say to them, the light in me is the light in you. Namaste. And it's like the final completion of the journey. It's beautiful. All right. You are so delightful. We were not meant to talk till today. I told you this when I met you last year. I could sit and talk to you all day long. You're one of those people, Mark. I'm going to have you finish out the show by finishing this sentence. Heart-centered leadership is?
Heart-centered leadership is being present, comma, all of you, comma, ever improving as you go. Something like that. If I had another chance at it, I'd probably edit that a little bit, but it is really showing up, and whatever is happening, almost like you said it several times here, is whatever is happening is what we have. That's what we're working at, and we bring ourselves to that.